Imagine you are standing on the bridge of a Chinese Type 052D guided missile destroyer, patrolling the contested, politically explosive waters of the Taiwan Strait. You are scanning the horizon, executing the aggressive, expansionist mandates of the People's Liberation Army Navy, Plan. You are expecting to see the gray hulls of the United States Navy's 7th Fleet. You are expecting to see the Aegis destroyers of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. You are expecting to see the frigates of the Republic of China Navy. But as the fog clears and the radar tracks solidify, the silhouette that emerges on your combat displays does not belong to any Asian or North American nation. It is a Baden-Württemberg-class frigate. It is flying the flag of the Federal Republic of Germany. A few hundred miles to the south, navigating the deep trenches of the Philippine Sea, Chinese anti-submarine helicopters drop sonobuoys, searching for American Virginia-class attack subs. Instead, their acoustic processors pick up the distinct, highly classified signature of a French Suffren-class nuclear-powered attack submarine. And pushing through the Strait of Malacca, projecting an impenetrable dome of radar coverage, is a massive carrier strike group centered around the 65,000-ton HMS Queen Elizabeth, flanked by Type 45 destroyers flying the white ensign of the British Royal Navy. To the admirals sitting in the Central Military Commission in Beijing, this is not just a confusing anomaly. It is a strategic nightmare. Why is a military alliance explicitly, legally, and historically named the North Atlantic Treaty Organization suddenly projecting overwhelming, lethal, and highly coordinated naval power into the tropical waters of the Indo-Pacific? Why are nations that share land borders with a hostile, mobilized Russian Federation sending their most expensive, elite, and finite surface combatants 10,000 miles away from their own home waters? For decades, authoritarian regimes banked their entire grand strategy on a single, comforting assumption: divide and conquer. They believed that the world was neatly compartmentalized. They assumed that if they initiated a crisis in the Pacific, the Europeans would stay out of it, terrified of losing access to Chinese markets. They assumed that if a land war erupted in Eastern Europe, the Asian democracies would look the other way. The presence of German, French, Italian, and British warships in the South China Sea is the brutal, kinetic proof that this authoritarian strategy has spectacularly, catastrophically failed. The concept of the regional war is officially dead. Driven by the no-limits partnership between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, the free world has realized a terrifying truth: the globe is no longer two separate chessboards. It is a single, interconnected, hyperfragile ecosystem. An attack on the supply chains of the Pacific is an immediate, existential attack on the survival of the European continent. But projecting power to the other side of the planet requires more than just political willpower. It requires logistics. It requires fuel. It requires dry docks, munitions depots, and safe harbors. It requires a fortress. And to find that fortress, the 32 nations of NATO have all turned their eyes to the exact same location on the map. They have turned to the sovereign, untouchable, and heavily industrialized continent at the bottom of the world. They have turned to Australia. Welcome to Doctrine of War. Today we are executing a deep-dive, forensic tactical analysis into the most massive, paradigm-shifting geographical realignment of the 21st century. Here is the thesis for this episode. In the modern era of hypersonic missiles and globalized supply chains, an alliance without a secure, forward-deployed logistical sanctuary is nothing more than a suicide pact. The United States cannot sustain a two-front global war alone. Europe cannot fight in the Pacific without a base of operations. And Australia cannot hold the Southern Hemisphere without allied naval mass. Therefore, the free world has executed the ultimate strategic merger. If you are beginning to understand why the true balance of global power is not decided by empty diplomatic declarations at the United Nations, but by the relentless, unsentimental mathematics of maritime logistics, dry dock capacity, and the fusion of continental industrial bases, hit that like button and subscribe to Doctrine of War. We strip away the political spin, the media outrage, and the simplistic narratives to bring you the cold, kinetic realities of how the free world actually builds, sustains, and fights. Your support ensures we can keep delivering this level of uncompromising strategic analysis. For years, commentators have viewed Australia's military buildup, the AUKUS nuclear submarines, the acquisition of Tomahawk cruise missiles, the massive base expansions, as purely a bilateral effort with the United States. But that is only half the story. Australia is not just preparing to host the Americans, it is actively terraforming its continent to serve as the ultimate southern anchor for the entire North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We are going to break down the indivisible theater, how the war in Ukraine and the militarization of the South China Sea forced the death of regional defense planning. We are going to expose the economic lifeline, the terrifying reality of the semiconductor shield, and why European heavy industry will literally collapse if they do not deploy their navies to protect Taiwan. We will explore the logistical fortress, the massive multi-billion-dollar investments at HMAS Sterling and the Henderson shipyard in Western Australia, creating the only safe harbor capable of repairing a European fleet out of range of Chinese missiles. And finally, we will analyze the horizontal escalation trap, the two-front grand strategy that links Australian critical minerals to European security, and European naval mass to Australian blockades. Let us begin by looking at the death of the old world order, and why the illusion of the isolated conflict was buried in the mud of Eastern Europe. The illusion of the two chessboards. To understand why European warships are currently cutting through the waters of the Pacific, you must first understand the psychological and strategic framework that governed the Western alliance for the last 75 years. During the Cold War, the geopolitical map was relatively simple, characterized by distinct, compartmentalized theaters of operation. NATO was built with a singular, laser-focused regional mandate: defend the North Atlantic and the European continent from the armored divisions of the Soviet Union pouring through the Fulda Gap. The famous Article 5 of the NATO Charter, the Collective Defense Clause, was explicitly, legally restricted to Europe and North America. Simultaneously, the security of the Pacific was managed through the hub-and-spoke system, where the United States acted as the central hub, holding bilateral defense treaties with individual nations like Japan, South Korea, and Australia. For decades, these two massive geopolitical chessboards rarely interacted. A British general worried about Russian tanks in Germany, an Australian admiral worried about instability in the Indonesian archipelago. The European powers outsourced the security of the Pacific entirely to the United States Navy's 7th Fleet. They viewed the rise of the People's Republic of China strictly through the lens of pure, unadulterated economics. China was a lucrative market, a cheap manufacturing floor, and an endless source of corporate profit. Geopolitics was neatly separated from trade. But in the early 2020s, a series of brutal, compounding strategic shocks violently shattered this illusion of isolation. The wake-up call of the no-limits axis. When the Russian Federation launched its massive, mechanized invasion of Ukraine, plunging the European continent back into the horrors of high-intensity industrial warfare, the capitals of Europe experienced a profound awakening. As the war dragged on, morphing into a grueling, artillery-heavy war of attrition, European intelligence agencies and military logisticians realized something terrifying. The Russian war machine was taking catastrophic losses, expending millions of artillery shells and thousands of armored vehicles. By all traditional economic metrics, the heavily sanctioned Russian industrial base should have collapsed within a year. But it didn't. It survived, and in many ways it thrived. The reason for this survival was not domestic Russian brilliance. It was the no-limits partnership declared between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping just weeks before the invasion. The European powers watched in horror as the People's Republic of China provided the ultimate unbreakable economic and industrial lifeline to Moscow. Chinese state-owned enterprises flooded Russia with dual-use technology, advanced microchips, heavy machine tools, optics for tanks, and raw materials. Furthermore, China purchased massive quantities of discounted Russian oil and gas, effectively funding the Russian war machine with billions of dollars in hard currency. Suddenly, the strategic planners in Paris, Berlin, and London experienced a geopolitical epiphany. They realized that you cannot fight Russia in the Donbass without simultaneously countering Chinese industrial leverage in the Pacific. They realized that the authoritarian regimes were not operating in isolated regional silos. They were operating as a coordinated, globally integrated anti-Western axis. If China was willing to underwrite the destruction of European security to keep the United States distracted, then Europe could no longer afford the luxury of ignoring Chinese expansionism in the Pacific. The concept of a regional war evaporated overnight. NATO recognized that the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific are a single, interconnected, hyperfragile ecosystem. It is an indivisible theater. The defense of Kiev, Warsaw, and Berlin is now physically, economically, and militarily tied to the defense of Taipei, Manila, and Canberra. But acknowledging the threat is one thing, deploying military power halfway across the globe to counter it is another. Why couldn't Europe simply rely on the United States to handle China? Why are European taxpayers funding naval deployments to the South China Sea? The answer lies in the brutal, terrifying vulnerability of the European economic engine. The myth of the military adventure. When domestic political critics in Europe see footage of a French Rafale fighter jet flying over the Pacific, or a German frigate docking in Tokyo, they often scream about military adventurism. They argue that European nations already struggling with inflation, energy crises, and the burden of supporting Ukraine, have absolutely no business provoking a superpower 10,000 miles away. They argue that Taiwan is an American problem, and that Europe should remain neutral to protect its massive trade relationship with Beijing. This argument is born of a profound, catastrophic ignorance of how the modern 21st century economy actually functions. The deployment of NATO naval and aerospace assets to the Indo-Pacific is not a charitable contribution to American foreign policy. It is not an imperial flex. It is a desperate, heavily armed, and absolutely vital deployment to protect the very arteries of the European continent. It is about the semiconductor shield, the arithmetic of annihilation. To understand the panic in European capitals, you must look at the brutal arithmetic of global technology supply chains. The island of Taiwan, operating under the constant existential threat of a Chinese amphibious invasion or a total maritime blockade, is not just a vibrant democracy. It is the undisputed, irreplaceable beating heart of the global digital economy. Specifically, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, and its associated ecosystem produce approximately 60% of the world's total semiconductor microchips. But the aggregate number hides the true terror. When it comes to the most advanced, bleeding-edge microchips, the sub-7 nanometer chips that power artificial intelligence, advanced telecommunications, supercomputers, and modern military targeting systems, Taiwan produces an astonishing 90% of the global supply. If the People's Liberation Army, PLA, executes a successful blockade of Taiwan, severing the island from the global maritime commons, or if the semiconductor fabrication plants, fabs, in Hsinchu and Tainan are destroyed in a kinetic conflict, the flow of advanced microchips stops immediately. For the European economy, this is not a recession. It is a rapid, cascading, apocalyptic industrial collapse. Let us map this out. The engine of the European economy is heavy industry and advanced manufacturing. Consider the German automotive sector, titans like Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Porsche. A modern electric vehicle or advanced combustion engine car is effectively a computer on wheels, requiring thousands of distinct microchips to manage everything from battery thermal dynamics to anti-lock braking systems. If the supply from Taiwan is severed, the assembly lines in Bavaria and Stuttgart grind to a total halt within weeks. Millions of highly skilled manufacturing jobs vanish. Consider the French aerospace industry. Airbus, the pride of European aviation, cannot manufacture commercial airliners without the highly specialized avionics and flight control computers that rely on Taiwanese silicon. The factories in Toulouse would fall silent. Consider the continent-wide push for green energy. The advanced inverters required for solar farms, the smart grid management systems routing wind power across borders. All of it relies on the continuous, uninterrupted flow of high-end semiconductors. If the first island chain falls, the European heavy industrial base collapses. The economic devastation would dwarf the fallout of the 2008 global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic combined. The resulting hyperinflation, mass unemployment, and societal unrest would tear the political fabric of the European Union apart. The NATO deployment doctrine. The leaders of Europe have done the math. They have realized that their economic survival is completely, utterly hostage to the stability of the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. They also realize that the United States Navy, the traditional guarantor of global sea lanes, is stretched to its absolute breaking point. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is massive, but it is facing a Chinese shipbuilding industry that is launching the equivalent of the entire French Navy every 4 years. In a high-intensity, multi-domain conflict involving thousands of anti-ship ballistic missiles, drone swarms, and cyber attacks, the U.S. Navy cannot guarantee the defense of the first island chain alone. They need mass. They need tonnage. They need more vertical launch cells in the water to intercept Chinese missiles. This is why NATO is pivoting to the Pacific. When the British Royal Navy deploys a carrier strike group to the Philippine Sea, they are not there to fight for Taiwanese independence. They are there to physically ensure that the cargo ships carrying the semiconductors required to keep the lights on in London can safely navigate the ocean. When a French nuclear submarine stalks the deep trenches of the South China Sea, it is protecting the supply chain of the French aerospace industry. It is the militarization of economic survival. But this massive strategic realization immediately slammed into a brutal, insurmountable geographic problem. How do you sustain a fleet of high-tech European warships 10,000 miles away from their home ports? The tyranny of distance and the threat ring. In the abstract world of grand strategy, it is easy to draw a line on a map and order a fleet to deploy to the other side of the planet. But in the ruthless, unsentimental reality of naval logistics, deploying a fleet is an exercise in managing friction, fuel, and catastrophic wear and tear. A modern warship, whether it is a British Type 45 destroyer or a French multi-mission frigate (FREM), is an incredibly fragile ecosystem of high-pressure gas turbines, delicate phased array radars, and complex weapon systems. They break. They require constant, intensive maintenance. If a European warship is operating in the South China Sea and suffers a mechanical failure in its propulsion plant, or if it takes battle damage from a near miss during a Chinese missile barrage, where does it go? It cannot limp 10,000 miles back to Portsmouth or Toulon. It would sink or be hunted down long before it reached the Mediterranean. Traditionally, the United States and its allies relied on the massive, highly developed naval bases in the first and second island chains. They relied on Yokosuka in Japan, or the sprawling facilities at Naval Base Guam. But in the 2020s, those historical sanctuaries have been transformed into highly vulnerable frontline targets. The Chinese rocket force has deployed thousands of intermediate-range ballistic missiles (IRBMs), specifically the DF-26, which is explicitly designed to strike Guam. In the opening hours of a high-intensity conflict, the dry docks, fuel depots, and runways of Guam and Okinawa will be subjected to a devastating, overwhelming saturation bombardment. If a British or French destroyer attempts to pull into Guam for repairs during a war, it is sailing directly into the crosshairs of a ballistic missile strike. The European navies looked at the map of the Indo-Pacific and realized they were facing a logistical death sentence. They needed a sanctuary. They needed a massive, heavily industrialized, deep-water port that was securely out of range of the vast majority of Chinese land-based conventional missiles. They needed a forward operating base that possessed the sovereign capability to weld steel, repair gas turbines, and reload vertical launch cells. There was only one landmass in the entire hemisphere that met every single requirement: the Australian continent. The industrial awakening of Western Australia. This is the exact reason why the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is turning to Australia, and why Australia is pouring billions of dollars into terraforming its western coastline. Australia is no longer just a diplomatic partner. It has been officially designated as the ultimate unsinkable southern anchor of the free world. To understand the scale of this integration, you must look at the massive, unprecedented infrastructure boom occurring right now south of Perth, Western Australia. At the center of this transformation is HMAS Stirling on Garden Island, the Royal Australian Navy's primary base on the west coast. Under the AUKUS agreement, Stirling is undergoing a multi-billion-dollar expansion to host Submarine Rotational Force West, SRF West, which will see U.S. Virginia-class and UK Astute-class nuclear-powered attack submarines permanently rotating through the base. This means that Stirling is being upgraded to the highest, most stringent, and most classified nuclear safety and maintenance standards on the planet. It is receiving massive new wharves, radiological control facilities, and heavy-lift cranes. But it is the facility located just a few kilometers down the coast that truly turns Australia into the logistical savior of the European fleets, the Henderson Defence Precinct. In late 2024, the Australian government announced a staggering $12 billion injection to transform the Henderson shipyards into a sovereign, continuous naval shipbuilding and maintenance megacomplex. This is the logistical fortress. If a British Type 45 destroyer operating in the Philippine Sea expends its entire magazine of Aster 30 interceptor missiles defending a convoy, it does not need to sail back to the UK. It sails south out of the combat zone, deep into the secure, untouchable sanctuary of the Indian Ocean, and pulls into HMAS Stirling or Henderson. Because of the deep, ongoing integration between NATO militaries and the Australian Defence Force, including the sharing of technical data packages and the standardization of munitions, Australian technicians and sovereign shipyard workers possess the knowledge, the tooling, and the clearances to repair European ships. They can patch the hull. They can repair the Rolls-Royce gas turbines, which power both British and Australian ships. They can reload the vertical launch cells with NATO standard munitions stockpiled safely in the Australian outback. Australia provides the strategic depth that Europe desperately lacks in the Pacific. We are the anvil upon which the broken ships of the Alliance can be reforged and sent back into the fight. Without the heavy industrial capacity of Western Australia, a sustained European naval presence in the Indo-Pacific is a mathematical impossibility. With it, NATO becomes a permanent, resilient, and highly lethal Pacific power. The two-front nightmare. The integration of NATO's naval power with Australia's logistical fortress is a brilliant tactical solution, but it serves a much higher, far more devastating grand strategic purpose. It is the operationalization of the horizontal escalation doctrine. Horizontal escalation is the ultimate geopolitical judo. It dictates that if an adversary attacks you in a specific theater where they hold a localized advantage, you do not simply fight them on their terms in that specific location. Instead, you escalate the conflict horizontally, striking them in a completely different geographic theater or economic domain where you hold the overwhelming advantage. By fusing the Euro-Atlantic alliance with the Indo-Pacific democracies, the free world has constructed a massive, inescapable two-front nightmare for the authoritarian axis of Russia and China. Let us wargame the two specific scenarios of horizontal escalation that this new global alliance enables. Scenario 1. The Resource Anvil War in Europe. Imagine that the Russian Federation launches a sudden, massive conventional escalation against NATO's eastern flank, perhaps a thrust into the Suwalki Gap or the Baltic states. Moscow's traditional strategy relies on energy blackmail. They assume that by restricting the flow of oil, gas, and critical minerals to Europe, they can fracture the political will of the NATO alliance, forcing them to sue for peace to avoid freezing in the dark or watching their defense industries grind to a halt. But the integration of Australia completely neutralizes this Russian strategy. If war erupts in Europe, Australia instantly activates as the resource anvil of the free world. Australia is a commodity superpower. It is one of the world's largest exporters of liquefied natural gas, LNG, uranium, coal, and crucially, the critical minerals required to manufacture modern weaponry. In a horizontal escalation scenario, the Australian government redirects its massive continent-sized export capacity away from unaligned or adversarial markets and floods the European continent with energy and raw materials. Australian LNG carriers replace the lost Russian gas, keeping the factories of Germany and the UK running. Australian lithium, rare earths, and titanium feed the European defense industrial base, allowing them to rapidly manufacture the artillery shells, missiles, and drones required to crush the Russian offensive. Australia becomes the untouchable, heavily industrialized rear-echelon supplier for the European war effort. We ensure that Moscow can never starve NATO into submission. Scenario 2. The distant blockade, war in the Pacific. Now flip the chessboard. Imagine that the People's Republic of China initiates a high-intensity kinetic conflict in the Pacific, a naval blockade of Taiwan or an aggressive move in the South China Sea. Beijing's strategy relies heavily on its anti-access/area denial, A2/AD, missile networks to keep the United States Navy at bay, fighting a localized, contained war where the PLA holds the numerical and geographic advantage. But the Western Alliance refuses to fight solely in the South China Sea. They escalate horizontally. This is where the NATO deployment to the Pacific becomes the ultimate civilization-ending weapon against the Chinese economy. As the U.S. Pacific Fleet and the Royal Australian Air Force engage the Chinese military in the first island chain, the combined naval mass of the European powers, the British, French, German, Italian, and Dutch surface fleets, deploy to the Indian Ocean. They do not sail into the teeth of the Chinese missile network. They utilize their bases in the Middle East, Diego Garcia, and crucially their secure logistical hubs in Western Australia, to execute a distant blockade. China suffers from the Malacca dilemma. Over 70% of its imported crude oil and a massive portion of its export economy must pass through the narrow, easily monitored choke points of the Indonesian archipelago, the Strait of Malacca, the Sunda Strait, and the Lombok Strait. The NATO fleets, supported by Australian P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft launching from the Cocos Islands, drop an impenetrable curtain of steel across these choke points. They use their massive blue water surface combatants to board, inspect, turn back, or sink any commercial supertanker or cargo ship attempting to supply the Chinese mainland with oil. This is a mission that requires massive naval tonnage and boarding capabilities, exactly what the European navies provide. They free up the US Navy to fight the kinetic war, while NATO and Australia systematically, physically starve the Chinese military-industrial complex of the energy it needs to function. Within months of a distant blockade, China's strategic petroleum reserves would run dry. The PLA's mechanized forces would be paralyzed. The Chinese economy would implode. This is the horizontal escalation trap. By fusing NATO and Australia, the free world ensures that any authoritarian aggression, anywhere on the globe, instantly triggers a devastating, synchronized, and insurmountable economic and military response from the other side of the planet. The deployment of NATO warships to the Indo-Pacific is not a temporary political statement. It is a permanent, structural rewiring of the global world order. For 30 years, the adversaries of the free world assumed that the democracies of the West were too fragmented, too obsessed with domestic politics, and too constrained by geography to ever form a truly unified global front. They banked their entire grand strategy on the illusion of the isolated conflict. The presence of European carrier strike groups in the Philippine Sea, and the billions of dollars pouring into the naval shipyards of Western Australia, proves that this authoritarian assumption was a catastrophic historic miscalculation. The era of regional warfare is dead. The Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific have fused into an indivisible theater. The defense of the semiconductor fabs in Taiwan is now the defense of the automotive factories in Germany. The defense of the skies over Ukraine is now tied to the surveillance flights of Australian wedgetails. By turning to Australia, NATO has found its southern anchor. They have secured the massive, industrialized, untouchable logistical fortress required to sustain a global fleet. They have guaranteed that the supply lines of the free world will remain open, while possessing the combined naval mass to sever the arteries of any nation that threatens the peace. The authoritarian Axis sought to divide and conquer. Instead, they forced the free world to lock shields, erase the borders of their alliances, and build a single, unbreakable global war machine. Thanks for watching Doctrine of War. Do you believe that European nations possess the political will to actually enforce a distant blockade and risk their own economies in a Pacific war? Or is this global alliance destined to fracture under pressure? Let us know your tactical assessment in the comments below. Stay sharp, stay unified, and we'll see you in the next one.